Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. This week, Dr. Anthony Fauci's new autobiography goes on sale, and it contains a horrifying chapter about his service under President Donald Trump during the coronavirus pandemic. It portrays Trump as lacking in the most rudimentary of knowledge, prone to fits of explosive rage, and perpetually narcissistically viewing major national events as being all about him. We think this should be covered not as a curiosity about the past, but as a loud, clanging alarm bell about what a second term of Trump would inflict on the country. And today we're discussing this with one of our favorite guests, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, who has written a series of great columns on voter amnesia about what Trump's last year in office was actually like, and the need for what one might call a great national remembering. It's great to have you back on, Paul.
It's good to be back.
So let's go through what Fauci reveals. At one point, he publicly remarked that vaccines being developed might not lead to long-lasting immunity, and Trump subjected him to a verbal tirade for telling Americans the truth as he saw it, including asking, "How could you do this to me?" Pure, unhinged megalomania. Fauci also details Trump's disregard for facts, his narcissistic exaggerations, his premature desire to reopen the country, and his reliance on highly unqualified advisors pushing quack cures, which he, of course, pushed himself. Paul, shouldn't this be front and center in our national discussion right now?
Yeah, I mean, so even leaving aside, we have this recent report from some CEOs who went in to meet Trump, took many of them sympathetic towards him, and were absolutely horrified that he was basically, what I would describe as having had elderly relative sundowning. He was incoherent and completely off. But also, there's this weird phenomenon now where people, Trump is floating policy proposals that are completely unworkable and disastrous. And in some peculiar way, people kind of discount it. Well, because obviously you can't replace income taxes with tariffs. Therefore, we shouldn't discuss the fact that Trump is proposing to do that. It's as if the fact that he's talking complete nonsense, it leaves him, forestalls criticism. If he had been proposing something that might actually happen, might actually work, then people will say, "Oh, well, that's a terrible idea." But the fact that it's terrible to the point of incomprehensibility means that somehow he's let off the hook.
It's amazing. And that's why I think what Fauci is revealing here is so important and relevant right now. I mean, here you have a very clear example of how Trump's unhinged, unfit temperament helped lead directly to a national catastrophe. I mean, you're talking about things he will never do that he's proposing because he's nuts. But here, we actually saw what happens when someone this unhinged runs the place.
Yeah, I mean, when we the peculiar thing about Trump's time in office was that he didn't get much done. He was unable to get much done. He passed a bad but sort of standard issue Republican tax cut. He barely failed to repeal Obamacare. And everything else just sort of coasted. And so you never really most people didn't get a full sense of just how bad, how unsuited for the job he was, because he really wasn't doing much of anything. And but then in 2020, confronted with a genuine national crisis that required intelligent decisions and leadership, all of that was revealed, and yet somehow or other, we were all kind of shut down emotionally, I think, and perceptually during the pandemic, and people have forgotten about it.
Right, and you've written about this Trumpstalgia problem, this tendency to forget what happened under Trump with COVID, but more broadly, too, with the economy, jobs, and crime, which were also big 2020 stories. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so let's face it. In the winter of 2019, 2020, in a lot of ways, America was in a pretty good place, I would say, having nothing to do with Trump, but he didn't, at least he didn't manage to screw it up. It was, we had finally emerged from the shadow of the financial crisis in 2008, partly because Republicans stopped imposing destructive fiscal austerity once a Republican was in the White House. Crime had fallen a lot over the previous 20 years. And so America, all of the usual things, vast inequalities were still there, but it was in a lot of ways the economy was pretty good, crime was pretty low. We are right back in that place. The economy right now looks, if anything, a little bit better than it did in 2019. The crime wave has subsided, but people forget there was a difficult period. There was a burst of crime. There was a burst of inflation. People forget that the burst of crime happened under Trump and has gone away now. The inflation was the aftermath of the pandemic. I spent a lot of time looking at it was a global thing. It turns out that if you use the comparable numbers, inflation in the United States and in Europe was, within a fraction of a percentage point equal over the period. We had exactly the same thing, but people have managed to somehow think of the Trump era as being the way the world was in December 2019, and somehow or other have, in many ways, come to believe that all of the bad stuff that happened along the way was somehow Biden's fault, even if it happened when Trump was still in the White House.
I think we're getting at a kind of a corollary problem that Trumpstalgia creates. In addition to people forgetting what happened in 2020, the result is that voters end up favoring Trump over Biden on a range of fronts, especially the economy and crime. It's just a bizarre paradox, right? Precisely because voters seem to discount 2020 as being caused, at least in part, by Trump's incompetence and unfitness for the presidency. Precisely because of that, they end up favoring Trump over Biden on these very things.
Crime is not my expertise, but at least I know how to read the numbers. And yeah, we had a bump in crime. Now, I remember when crime was really high, and it never got that bad, but we did have a bump in crime, which pretty much all happened while Trump was in office. And yet people have forgotten that, and of course there's a lot of just flat out lying on the part of Republicans saying, crime is at unprecedented levels now, when in fact the country is safer than it was in 2019, as far as we can tell. And that's just a perceptual thing. You wouldn't have thought that the question of who was actually president in 2020 might become a determinative factor in this election, and yet it is. I spent a lot of time on inflation, obviously. And there what we have is there's really no question now that the inflation, we did have a bump in inflation. It was more like a one-time rise in prices rather than a sustained increase in the rate of inflation. And because it happened everywhere, not just in the United States. And because it went away without any, we didn't need a recession, although those predictions were wrong. It's quite clear that that was not a Biden policy thing. Biden didn't do that. COVID did that. And but people are in this mood of blaming Biden. I mean, it's also true that we just had the European elections, which were disastrous for the governing parties all across Europe. So it's also true that the Europeans blame their leaders for stuff that really was nobody's fault except the coronavirus. But it is upsetting. You really look at this situation now. Not only that people blame the wrong people for the bad stuff that happened, but that people believe that bad stuff is continuing to happen when it isn't. I mean, it remarkable. You've seen these, of course. When we look at swing state polls, a lot of evidence. If you ask people, how's the economy? They say it's terrible. And they ask them, how are you doing? They say, I'm okay. If you ask, how's your state's economy doing? They think it's pretty good. So people have this idea that really bad stuff is happening, but to somebody out there, somebody I don't know. The closer it is to their personal experience, the more favorable people are.
I will say that very fact makes it all the more puzzling when people go out there and say, well, you can't tell people the truth about the state of the economy because it'll offend them because of how they feel. But the problem with that is that they actually feel pretty good a lot of the time.
That's right. Lived experience is that people are doing okay. There's always somebody hurting. But lived experience is that people are doing okay financially. People can afford stuff. The grocery prices are up a lot, but so are wages, and so the lived experience of people is that things are okay. What has happened is I can go do this whole thing. There's a kind of what are the things we know about public opinion on the economy, and what kind of explanation can make sense of it? And anything has to start from the fact that people's lived experience is okay, and that the stuff that they say that's negative is all about something happening to other people someplace far away, and that means that they're getting a narrative. We can talk about who's responsible for that narrative, but it's not about people's own lives.
There seems to be almost a twofer of a problem here. On the one hand, voters seem to give Trump a pass for the pandemic, which we discussed, but that creates this other problem where voters aren't really aware of how effectively the country was brought back from the crisis under Biden. I mean, as you're pointing out, voters are mad about inflation, but that's partly a hangover effect of the pandemic. It happened abroad as well. And then, of course, there's the other side of this, which is that the recovery package signed by Biden prevented a ton of needless suffering. I mean, here's a thought experiment. Like, what percentage of voters do we think is even aware that in many ways the country's rebound from the pandemic kind of bested other parts of the world?
I would guess that not 1 in 10. I'd be surprised if it was 1 in 10. Voters is aware that we have the best recovery among major economies. In general, Americans don't know very much about. We're a big insular country, and we tend not to know about what's happened elsewhere. But I would be shocked if it was as much as 10% of the public is aware that the U.S. has the strongest recovery in the advanced world. In general, I think, we know from polling that, half the country thinks we're in a recession. We've actually had a miraculously good job market. And so to ask that they not only be aware that we're not in a recession, but in fact that we've had the best recovery in the G7 this is not happening.
And I think we should stress to all the pundits who constantly lecture those who point out the actual state of the economy. We should point out to them that it's possible to say there's still a long way to go for a lot of people, but nonetheless, things really are better for most people in the country by their own declarations to pollsters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of a catch-22 here. Certainly, I encounter it all the time. You say, look, the economy is actually doing. First of all, there's a certain element. I have to say, there are some people on the left who don't want to hear good things about the economy because they feel that if you say that anything is going right, that will diminish the pressure to fix the vast injustices that still exist in America. But, unfortunately, the perfect is the enemy of the good here, and you really do have to ask, how will things be if Trump wins? And then, of course, the people on the right for whom it's an article of faith that things must be terrible because it's a Democrat in the White House. And then people get mad if you say, well, but actually things are not that bad. And the way we know that is not just the government statistics say that they're not bad, but if you ask people, how are you doing? Roughly 3/4 of Americans say that they're doing at least okay financially. So there's but if you say that, then people say you're insulting me. You're accusing me of you're denying my experience, but I'm not. I'm saying that according to the surveys, your experience is actually pretty positive. It's your narrative that I'm denying.
Well, I think maybe it's actually elite pundits who say that voters will react that way, which is kind of ironic in a funny way. I mean, they sort of position themselves as these kind of MAGA whisperers, right? Working class whisperer types who know exactly what all these people are thinking whenever someone points out the actual state of the economy. So I don't even know whether voters hold it against people or not, but we are told that they do.
I mean, we certainly, all the people who say that you mustn't, you'll offend voters if you boast of, if Biden talks about good stuff, that people will be offended. Did Trump ever acknowledge that anything wasn't perfect in his economy? Come on. Why are the rules different here? And of course, all we're asking is, what I've written is, I don't want Biden to make outlandish claims about how great things are. I just think that he and his people should tell the truth, which means acknowledging that there's lots that we'd like to fix about the American economy, but also that by historic standards, by international standards, we're doing pretty well.
There's actually another point to be made about this as well. I mean, as we discussed earlier, inflation is at least partly a hangover from both COVID, but also, I guess, from the fact that we spent a whole lot of money to prevent poor and working people from falling into absolute catastrophe at a moment of major national crisis. Let me ask you, do you think that spending is partly a cause of the current inflation? But also I want to ask you this as well. I think Eric Levitz has made this point that if we try to discount the fact that inflation was caused by the spending and sort of treat this as something we don't want to talk about, then we end up kind of reinforcing a message that doesn't actually inform people, because it doesn't inform people that we spent because it was a good thing to do. And inflation maybe was a worthwhile price to pay for the fact that millions and millions of people were spared catastrophe.
Yeah. So, I mean, in principle, but what happened, one way to think about 2020 is that temporarily a lot of the economy had to be shut down because of pandemic. But we protected we did by normal standards, policy standards, we did a very good job of protecting people from financial pain. Not perfect. Some people fell through the cracks, but it was still quite amazing. And by the way, that was some people looked at the bills, at the CARES Act during that and said, this looked like a bill written by Democrats. Well, it was. Basically, Trump signed the Democratic policy in the midst of the crisis. That you would expect to lead to some inflation because you're maintaining purchasing power when productive capacity is down. So unchanged spending meets diminished capacity. Now, it's actually a little bit funny. The numbers don't support that interpretation of inflation very well because the Europeans did a lot less. They also, in their own way, did a lot of support, but not on the same scale we did. And yet their inflation outturn is literally, it's like 19.6% cumulative for us and 19.8% for them. And so it's but mostly mostly the inflation was because we had these big disruptions. Both that a lot of stuff was shut down, couldn't be done, and also because people spent on different stuff. People who couldn't go out bought a lot of physical stuff instead. So we had supply chain problems. Remember all the problems of the ships that couldn't unload their cargoes. All of which was a temporary result. And in the end, from a human point of view, what we did was very nearly ideal. We had a one-time jump in the level of prices, but that was matched by a rise in incomes. Inflation is now down to basically where we want it to be. We never experienced mass unemployment. We have, we actually, the adjusted for an aging population, employment levels are very high. Looks like productivity is good. We basically came out of this. There was a lot of talk when COVID struck that we'd have long-term scarring of the economy. And there's no hint of that. By almost every measure I know, we're better than we expected to be before COVID struck.
It just strikes me that to whatever degree inflation was caused by some of our spending, when we treat inflation as the biggest problem we face, we end up misleading voters. I mean, I wonder, maybe this is just too hard a communication challenge, but it would seem that there would be some way to say to people, our response to COVID was a success. The fact that we spent a lot of money to protect a lot of people from utter disaster is a good thing. It was a humane answer in the midst of a terrible crisis. And if that did cause some inflation, well, what else were we going to do? Of course, I mean, it was worth it. I mean, I think we have to inform people that the spending to help millions avoid calamity was a positive.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually, as I said, I'm a little skeptical that was actually a major cause of inflation. But even if it had been, the fact that we went through something, 30 million people lost their jobs because it was too dangerous for them to work during the worst of the pandemic. Basically the economy went into a coma necessarily, and not many, poverty went down. People's standard of living was really not severely hurt at all. That's a triumph. We got through this disastrous attack on the economy by the virus, and we emerged from it with having suffered minimum hardship and with the economy, by all appearances, as strong as it ever was. So yeah, this was a good. I mean, if you try to, there were actually some efforts really early on by some economists to describe what would be the optimal policy response from the point of view of the welfare of the average American, and what we actually did was pretty close to that optimal response. We a one-time rise in prices that did not turn into sustained inflation. Full employment quickly restored, much faster than after the last crisis. This is good. We did well.
The thing is that, I think we really need to sort of focus to some degree on the role of our disastrous information environment in creating this public opinion mess that Democrats face. I mean, Trump says over and over and over again that COVID was imposed on the country from the outside and that his handling of it was brilliant and perfect. And that Biden has been nothing but a disaster. And I wonder whether that message coming from the right, which is blared forth 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by pretty much every single right-wing media outlet you can think of, I wonder if that kind of has created the public opinion situation we're in. It seems like Biden and Democrats could be maybe saying more clearly that Trump wrecked the place because he's unfit for the presidency. Biden and Dems brought us back. Perfect? No. A lot of pain still, but, as you say, in some ways, it was a highly admirable response. And the problem that Trump helped unleash are getting fixed, and the country's a fairer and more equitable place than it was under Trump. Is there some way to say that more forcefully and convincingly?
All of us who are on this stuff are, frustrated. How exactly do you get this across? It is, certainly true that there's right-wing media and right-wing politicians constantly blare not just the maximum pessimal interpretation, but just flat-out lies about inflation, about crime, and there's nothing equivalent on the other side. And if anything, a lot of people, certainly in the mainstream media, people in to some extent centrists, they feel like they should not talk about the good stuff. So that if there have been some actual studies here, we know that it's been quantified that when gas prices fluctuate a lot. They're a very bad measure. It's hard to think of anything that's less under control of the president. But still, when gas prices are high, there's enormous media coverage. When they fall again, and they've been on a roller coaster, no coverage of that. So people only hear about the bad stuff. And now, how much I don't know what the political strategy for countering that is, although judging from what we've seen in the past few years, a Trump-like strategy of saying everything is perfect and I'm wonderful and anything bad is somebody else's fault actually seems to work better than being honest.
Absolutely, and I think crime is an illustrative example, too. Brian Beutler has made an interesting point. He's argued that in a way you can blame the 2020 spike in violent crime on Trump. I mean, let's just go through the record here, and this feeds back to the Fauci stuff. He used COVID to stoke fury at public officials, mostly Dems who are just doing their best by their own lights to prevent mass death among their constituents. He mused about walling off diseased parts of the country to protect them from more virtuous red parts. He basically supercharged social tensions at a moment of absolute crisis, turned everyone against each other. I don't know if that's directly responsible for violent crime, but maybe we can put this potential connection on the table for discussion. I mean, Biden, and here's something else he could say. He came in, tried to calm everything down. He governs for all Americans, not just his supporters. He doesn't feverishly demonize the opposition as vermin, and crime has come down. And by the way, he did also sign the largest gun control bill in decades. So, maybe there's a way to say crime was terrible under Trump, at least to some degree, because Trump is crazy and has degenerate intentions toward the country and towards anyone who doesn't vote for him.
Well, I mean, the way I would put it is that, as best we can understand, what COVID did was it produced a lot of social isolation, and probably therefore a lot of psychological backlash. Kids couldn't summer programs that might have kept them out of trouble were put on hold. It's not clear how much exactly could have been done, but there was some, and in particular, if you go places by and large, blue cities, blue states did their best to get those programs going again and restore as much of normal social life as they could as soon as it was reasonably safe to do so. And of course, encouraging vaccinations also helped. And if you look, it's exactly the places that had some fairly serious uptick in crime presumably because of the pandemic, where it has now plunged again. And so I'm not sure that we can say that, that Trump did it, although he certainly did nothing by making crime always an issue about, violent immigrants, or instead of what it really was, which was largely just people acting out because their lives had been disrupted. He certainly didn't help. And the real story is that I think I'm actually astonished by how well American society seems to have healed from all of this. And I follow, I live in New York, and first of all, there's people have enormous misconceptions, right? I was in another part of the country recently, and people were asking me, so how dangerous is New York? The answer is it's one of the safest places in America. And we have enough crime data in for 2024 now to say that the Trump crime wave in New York is completely gone. Murders are right back to where they were before the pandemic. And so now, Trump just in general, I think the main thing is that Trump's irrationality and foot dragging and injecting bleach and all of that, several 100,000 people who didn't have to die died. And that's if when you're president of the United States and several 100,000 people die unnecessarily on your watch, that's a pretty serious indictment.
So let's bring it back to Fauci's book, because this chapter is all about how his unfit temperament helped lead to that, several 100,000 needless deaths potentially. I mean, what troubles me is that the news stories about the chapter almost treat Fauci's revelations as kind of a retrospective on something that's long gone. It's like a contribution to the historical record, a little asterisk, a footnote, But why aren't we talking about this as like a clear, loud warning sign about what a Trump restoration would be? Let's make it forward-looking.
Yeah, we should. I mean, look, Trump is not the same guy he was in 2020. He's much worse. Right? But all indications are that he is everything that was a personality flaw, should have been disqualifying personality flaw in 2020, has gotten far worse over the past 4 years in the face of losing an election, in the face of being convicted of felonies. Trump was already in many ways a sort of caricature of a narcissistic politician with no regard for other people's welfare, but now he's a caricature of a caricature. I think if he makes it back in, the future historians, if we have any future, will find it incredible that such a person could have gotten anywhere near the White House.
We're all incredulous about this possibility, but if we look at our information environment and how a lot of this stuff is discussed and how Trump is soft-pedaled relentlessly, it starts to become explicable, unfortunately. You certainly are doing your best to correct that, and we appreciate that really greatly. Thanks so much for coming on, Paul. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Folks, some new content up at TNR.com for you to check out. Daniel Cantor and William Crystal on fusion voting and why it's a way to save the country, and Matt Ford on the Supreme Court's bump stock decision and how it just made future mass shootings even deadlier. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.